Hi everyone, welcome to Activating Genius, how to get your child into a top college and set for a happy, successful life. Today we have the good fortune of interviewing Julia Rogers, who serves on the board of directors of the Gap Year Association. The Gap Year Association promotes the responsible growth of the gap year option in America. Julia Rogers founded En Route Consulting in 2008, inspired by the idea that more young Americans should engage in service work and travel as a way of learning about themselves and the world around them. Now, nearly a decade later, she has guided hundreds of students and their parents through the gap year planning process. In addition to private consultations, Julia enthusiastically advocates for the popularization of the gap year through public talks, visits to high schools, and networking with guidance counselors and family professionals. In 2017, Julia was awarded the first ever Gap Year Association Award in Innovation for her work in the gap year industry. Julia is a graduate of Hamilton College in New York. She and her family frequently embark on research trips to personally investigate gap year program locations. Most recently, Julia and her family spent a month in Hawaii to research programs on Oahu. In addition to traveling, she enjoys hiking, snowboarding, reading, photography, and event planning. Originally from New Jersey, Julia has lived in the UK, Maine, Tennessee, Montana, Wyoming, and Tanzania. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the work you're doing. It sounds like you won an award for doing something innovative in the industry. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. Well, I guess the exciting thing about the gap year in the United States is that it's very new. It's a new concept. The gap year is a rite of passage that is quite common in the UK and across Europe and in Australia and places like that. But we're kind of just embracing the concept, and it's a really exciting moment in time for both young people and people who are in experiential education. So there is a lot of innovation going on. So the acknowledgement that I got through that innovation award was because of some social media outreach and some specific awareness activation that I was doing around the gap year. So it's just been a really fun thing to be a part of, and to kind of always be thinking about how can we engage more people and how can we get more people to accept this and take that leap into taking a gap year.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You started out by saying that this is common in Europe and other countries. Can you tell us a little bit about, how common that is? I've heard of students backpacking in Europe, for example, and things like that. I just don't know, is that at a certain age? Is it like a rite of passage, or how does that work?
Sure. I mean, it varies country to country. I think it's something like 10% of British students take a gap year and upwards of 20% in other countries. So it is quite common. And in some countries I know that people will say, in the same way that we do in the States, where are you going to college, almost like as this assumption of going to college. People will say towards the end of senior year of high school, where are you going on your gap year? So it's that kind of part of the cultural fabric in that kind of upper high school and onwards to college years.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So and that's like a semester or a year that people take off before they go on to university, for example?
Yeah, exactly. And it's, in the UK especially, university is subsidized, so it's a lot less expensive to go. So a lot of times the British gap year is modeled on working for about 3 to 6 months and then traveling. And yes, backpacking across Europe, going to Southeast Asia, volunteering, all sorts of kinds of travel experiences are kind of woven into the idea of the British or the European gap year. And the American gap year is a little bit different in that there's a little bit more learning involved. We kind of see it as an opportunity for people to both kind of engage their soft skills, their problem solving, critical thinking, and building on their EQ, as well as some, building on their resume through maybe some internships and some really engaging service work, or nurturing themselves and enriching themselves through courses or other types of activities that are just purely for their own enjoyment and just to learn something new.
Okay, great. So tell us a little bit about Gap Year Association. I understand that you are the accrediting agency in the United States. Is that right?
Correct. Alongside this new industry are a lot of programs, some of who have been around for, decades, and others that are, relatively new to the space. And a lot of people are offering these programs for young people, and yet no one was really giving them the seal of approval. So Ethan Knight founded the Gap Year Association in order to offer this service to the greater public of, being able to say, a group of people have looked at these programs. We've looked at their, safety standards, their ethics, the kinds of experiential learning and mentorship that they're offering to people, and we say that they are a high-quality program. And as somebody who's sat in on and advised on a number of accrediting organizations now, I can say that is a very lengthy and involved process. So any program that makes it to the other side of the accrediting process has done their due diligence.
Interesting. Okay. And how many programs do you have who are accredited?
I want to say now there's about 10 to 12 who have an active accreditation. I know there's always organizations that are in queue who are in process, and sometimes that process can take anywhere from 6 months to a couple of years, depending on how much work they have to do on the back end. And then there's also we not only accredit Gap Year programs, but now we also accredit counselors, and we also Gap Year specific counselors, and also Gap Year friendly colleges and universities. So 3 kind of tiers of accreditation now are offered.
Interesting. Okay. And so universities want to become accredited because they feel that students will, more likely choose to come to their university if they know that they're friendly. Is that how it works?
Exactly. It's one more way for a college to say to a student, we not only acknowledge that you've taken a gap year, but we think that was a great idea, and we want to make it easy for you to defer your admission, to accept credits that may have been accumulated on gap time, to offer certain types of services that gap year students might need, like clubs and other types of, returning from, a lot of times, transformative experiences need kinds of, a little bit of extra support or buffering. We call it a soft landing. So these colleges have all, both on the back end in their systems, have made it a little bit easier for Gap Year students to arrive on campus, and they're also providing these upfront and face-to-face services for Gap Year students.
Interesting. And Gap Year can be taken during university too, right? It doesn't have to be right after high school. Mm-hmm.
Certainly, yeah, and I think that there's, I think that it's somewhat ideal to take a gap year after high school, especially if you've already deferred from your college of choice, because then you it's kind of part of a 5-year plan, and it's very intentional, and you can plan it accordingly. But for some students, they discover after freshman or sophomore year that they may be at the wrong school, or they may be in the wrong major, and they really need to take a breath. And I would say that it's always better to pump the brakes, take a breath, do some other types of learning and other types of experiences while you maybe apply to it, while you transfer, or just while you get your wits about you, then kind of pushing through all 4 years, not really engaging as you should in the college experience, which is, such an amazing period of life. Yeah,
that's very interesting. And are there any highly competitive universities that are friendly in terms of gap years?
Oh, definitely. I would say that a lot of the Ivies are not only friendly but encouraging of the gap year, Harvard being one of the most well-known gap year friendly schools. I mean, we can name a bunch of students who are who have gone to Harvard after taking a gap year, Malia Obama being one of the most prominent ones. Also, Yara Shahidi, who's an actress, just took a gap year and started at Harvard. So, there's a lot of Harvard is a well-known gap year proponent. Tufts also has an in-house gap year program, as does Princeton, meaning they actually have their own gap year program that they allow Princeton or Tufts students to partake in. UNC Chapel Hill is a really big gap year school, Colorado College, Middlebury. So a lot of these highly competitive schools, they want students to take a gap year. Sometimes they're actively even seeking them to take a gap year in their acceptance letters. Some of them say, consider a gap year, and we'd be happy to defer you if you're doing something meaningful, because gap year students are showing up on campus more sure of themselves, more mature, sometimes with better knowledge of what they want to study and why they really want to be there, which is so important to having a successful college experience.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you recommend for a student who wants to do something different instead of jumping right into college, or even if they're in university and they don't know where to begin? How should they go about designing a gap year? Because I noticed a Gap Year Association seems very keen on promoting gap years for all students. So that's quite a big vision.
Right.
So some people, of course, there's programs that are already pre-made, and you can join one of those. And some of those are costly, and so I'm wondering, especially for students who don't have a lot in terms of money to work with, what kinds of recommendations would you make?
Definitely. Well, I think that, step one of the planning process, when someone kind of either intuits or actively seeks out a gap year, knows that it's going to be a good thing for them, there's usually a reason. So identifying that reason why a gap year is a good move for that particular student is going to be that's going to be an indicator of what kinds of opportunities they need to partake in to really get the most out of it. So kind of that self-evaluation. Okay, am I taking a gap year because I don't know what I want to study? Am I taking a gap year because I don't feel mature enough to really appreciate college? Am I taking a gap year because I'm super burnt out from a very intensive high school experience, and I just, I can't imagine going into a classroom after this, the going through the gauntlet of applying to colleges. So there's a lot of reasons why people want to take gap time, and knowing that is a really good thing. And then the second step is kind of thinking about, what in your dream world, would you experience? Do you want to, hike a mountain in Nepal? Do you want to do an internship in a major city? Do you want to do some really meaningful service work somewhere? And if you don't know, that's okay, but sometimes people have a geographic region they're drawn to, or they know they want to learn a certain language, or they want to go back to where their family is from and do a heritage trip. So sometimes there's a little bit of a draw to something, and that's a good place to start research. And then, the Gap Year Association also has a planning tool. It's a downloadable PDF that can also give you some of those initial steps to give you some guidance to doing research. But the great thing about gap years is that they're so customizable and so personalized in a way that is almost unimaginable to most 18-year-olds who have gone through a relatively cookie-cutter college admissions process. So it takes a little bit of research to really understand all that's out there, but it's also, to your point, it's also really important for people to understand that it can be done for any budget. There's programs, for instance, AmeriCorps, which is essentially the domestic arm of the Peace Corps. You're eligible for many AmeriCorps programs if you're 18 and have graduated high school. So you can do a program like City Year or NCCC and get a stipend while you're doing it and an education award at the end. So a lot of students who are low on funds but want a really intensive and challenging and worthwhile experience will gravitate towards AmeriCorps programs, and they can stay here in the country for that. For students who want to travel internationally but want to do it on a budget, you can actually work abroad in several countries. If you're under the age of 30, you can get a special working holiday visa in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland. So sometimes people will go and actually work and earn their keep for a few months and then save up a little bit of money and go travel, something like that. So that's a great option. And there's also low-cost volunteer opportunities and work exchange opportunities, which if people have heard of, working on organic farms or working at bed and breakfast in exchange for their room and board, there's all sorts of ways to actually travel for very inexpensively.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like the gap year is basically designed by the student, right?
That's the idea, yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of, there's just so many options out there. I mean, it would take a lot of research and planning for each student in a very unique way, depending on their needs.
Yeah, and There's a little bit of a formula. Most people, again, with that self-evaluation, people know how independent they are. I've worked with students who, they went to boarding school, or their family were very, were very travel-oriented in their growing up years, so they felt kind of ready to do things on their own right away. A lot of students are not that, not ready to just go and backpack through Europe, right after graduating high school. So in a lot of ways, you want to think about the gap year as starting with more structure and more support through maybe some structured experiences like service learning programs or courses where you have a group and leaders and things like that, and kind of moving into more independent experiences as the year goes on and taking on more independence and more challenge as you feel ready for it. So it's important to know your starting point and then kind of take on more as the year moves on.
Okay. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And how does it work in terms of the university when let's say you complete a gap year and you're coming now to the university that you were admitted to and that you accepted an offer at? Do students feel like they're out of place because they're a year older than most of their peers?
It's interesting. There's definitely a reentry process for students, especially once you've spent significant time abroad in another culture. People have what's called, reverse culture shock. So they actually, sometimes the coming home process can be even harder than the going away process for students. And that usually, that discomfort usually settles over the summer, and then once they start school, they do feel more ready for it. But that being said, there's always going to be an adjustment period, and usually that first semester of freshman year for almost every student, whether they're a gap year student or not, is a little bit rocky. And so I definitely hear from gap year students that they arrive on campus, they feel older, and they sometimes are older, but they feel more mature than their freshman peers. So they tend to gravitate towards upperclassmen, or sometimes they'll join clubs that are associated with the interests that they discovered on their gap time, and kind of they'll find their tribes. But it's sometimes they need to be forewarned that they're going to feel that way, and then they can usually roll with it.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And what do you recommend for students who want to take a gap year but whose parents don't see the value of it?
Well, I think that you can definitely come at a parent with some statistics. I think that a rational argument is probably the best one, and there's some really great data to support the gap year. Almost to the point where I see the reverse more often than parents not wanting their kid to take a gap year. It's almost sometimes students being resistant to taking a gap year when their parents want them to. But if you are in the position where you really want to take a gap year and your parents are like, why would you want to do that? I would visit the Gap Year Association website and go to the Data and Benefits page. There is a slew of information on there to support gap years, and that would include statistics about how gap year students have higher GPAs, and they tend to graduate in fewer years than traditional students. 90% of gap year students will start college within a year of starting their gap time, so that alleviates that fear of parents that may have that their child may never start college if they take a gap year. Right. We have found that's kind of a myth. So and there's also some really strong data around students discovering what they want to major in and what they want to do and how employable they feel after their gap time. A lot of strong data around that.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think a lot of parents do have that fear, but I think that it sounds like the stats don't support that. Number one, but also number two, the students already applied to college and been admitted, so it's different. Maybe if the student had not applied to college and was just taking time before they applied to university, would those be different statistics then that show what's going on?
No, the statistics that we have don't differentiate between people who've deferred from admission to college and people who are maybe applying to school on their gap time or who haven't applied for other reasons. But I would say that, it's still a cultural Not, I wouldn't say necessarily it's as far. I mean, not in every social circle or community is it a cultural expectation to go to college, but it's certainly an aspiration for most people to go to college. And students feel that. Most students do want to have that college experience, and so there's nothing about a gap year that's going to diminish that desire to have a college experience. And if a student comes away from a gap year really not wanting to go to college, then that might be an indicator that a 4-year school might not be the best fit for them, and then they should explore other very valid routes. So, I kind of throw that out there too. It's a good time for discovering what other paths are out there.
Okay, good. And what advice do you have for the reverse, for parents who want their students to take gap years, but the student isn't ready and jumping on it?
Yeah. Well, a lot of times it has that reservation on the student side has to do with not feeling like it's a common choice or feeling alienated by the idea of doing something different than their peer group, where especially if a lot of them are going off to college after high school. So finding a cousin or a friend or someone who's taken a gap year and had a really great experience who can chat with that student, that's a great way to kind of get them on board. The peer-to-peer thing is going to be way better than anything a parent could say to their child. But if that's not available, I would say the other thing that you can do is think about what that they would really love to do. If they have an interest or if they had taken a family trip and had really grabbed on to some aspect of it, to try and find a program or an opportunity that could really tease out that interest and then present that to them as an idea, or offer them offer them the option to plan their own year and give them a lot of ownership over it, because I think that is something that students don't necessarily at the beginning really understand as such a gift. But this idea that you can really, within reason, the world is your oyster, and this is a time to explore, experiment, to learn about yourself, and the payoff is so great relative to this very short period of time. I mean, the takeaways from a gap year last a lifetime, and the return on investment for a college experience after a gap year is very, very real too.
Yeah, it is. That's a good idea about peers, sharing positive experiences. I think you're right on with that. Do you have any stories of students that you've worked with recently who had a positive experience that you'd like to share?
Oh, sure, yeah. One of my students, her name was Michelle, she really wanted to gain fluency in Spanish on her gap year, and she was kind of bootstrapping it herself. Her parents were supportive of the idea, but not supportive financially. So she saved a lot of money, and she also got a scholarship to put towards her travels, and she ended up spending almost 2.5 months in Guatemala studying at a Spanish school and living with a local family. And then she came home for the holidays. After the holidays, she went to Oaxaca, Mexico, and she did an internship with a microfinance organization that gives microloans to women-owned businesses in the Oaxaca Valley. And after that experience, she actually backpacked solo for 2.5 months in Colombia and Peru. So she trekked Machu Picchu. She was traveling overland in the Amazon by boat. And she did meet people along the way, but she was traveling on her own for that 2.5 month period of time to end her gap year. So when we talked about that after her experience, I was just blown away by not only her initiative to take a gap year and to have this goal and to work towards it so completely, but also to just to be so intrepid. I was so impressed, and she's just a really special person. And that's what I see a lot in gap year people, is that they are really, they make it happen, and they can do some really amazing things and things that we don't always think 18-year-olds are capable of, and they really are when they're given the chance.
Yeah. There's so much to do outside of school, because school is so structured these days, and like you said, it's cookie cutter, the approach that most schools take. So having a self-directed kind of time to do things and to explore your real potential is quite amazing. Definitely agree with that.
Yeah,
what about
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the lessons that people take away from that, sometimes people think, she was just traveling through Southeast Asia, or she was just walking the El Camino Trail in Spain, like what are you going to get from that? But, I think that we've, as a society, have kind of diminished the idea of time and taking time for oneself to really get to know oneself. But I think that there's such value in that, and especially feeling comfortable with oneself before taking that next step into higher education.
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely a big supporter of taking time to reflect and stop what you're doing, take time out. I think I took about 8 months off when I was at Harvard, and it was very transformative. I went back and I was refreshed, and I knew I was approaching my studies in a whole different mentality, and I felt older and wiser, and I can definitely vouch for that.
I've never spoken with somebody who's taken gap time and not thought it was the best thing they've ever done, and I still have not met that. I've not met. It's like a white whale that that's someone who is going to come out of the woodwork someday saying that it was a bad decision. But that is, in the 10 years I've been doing this, I've never heard anybody say anything close to that.
Yeah, totally. Then some people, though, I mean, I didn't do like what your student was doing. I didn't go backpacking alone and all of that. So I find that still pretty courageous, because that's, something I don't feel comfortable doing yet. But
sure.
I know there's programs out there where groups of students gather together, and then there's a guide and things like that. That sounds like something I would be more inclined to participate in.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And there's such learning and socialization to be had with those kinds of programs too. You can really, really bond with your group, because usually they're very small. They're 10 or 12 other gap year students plus your leaders. So you just have such an opportunity to get to know people on a deeper level and basically make friends for life. So that's a really special kind of experience too.
Yeah, it is definitely. Mm-hmm. Well, Julia, is there anything else you would like to say before we close?
Well, whenever I ask my gap year students that question, I always say, what would you tell people who are considering a gap year? And almost uniformly they say, just do it. So that's what I would tell people if you're listening to this interview and you're, waffling on the idea, or you kind of know in your heart that this is a route that you think that you want to take. I would say just do it, and the details will work themselves out with some effort and with some inspiration. So, take that leap. And also, one of the things that I do offer anybody who needs more, guidance and planning is free introductory calls. So if you're thinking that you are interested in this idea of a gap year but really need a little bit more information about it before you decide for sure, feel free to get in touch with me, and we can set up an hour-long chat and just go over different ideas and talk about your situation and how it pertains to you.
Oh, great. That's a wonderful gift. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Our listeners will take advantage of that. That's really, really nice. Well, thank you, Julia, so much for being on the interview today. It was wonderful to talk with you, and we really appreciate all your experience and enthusiasm for the gap years. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.